Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, challenges and opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. Whether you're working on local adaptation projects, planning for climate risk, or simply looking for hope backed by science, you're in the right place. If you enjoy these conversations, be sure to follow the podcast and subscribe wherever you listen. Share with your friends and colleagues too, anyone interested in building a more resilient future. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Joining me today is Kate Guest, the Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Change at Historic England. Historic England is the public body that looks after England's historic environment. They champion historic places to help people understand, value and care for them. And they help to deliver schemes that bring buildings into use, tell the stories of communities and their spaces, and restore pride in local heritage. So we're going to have a great conversation today, and Kate, I'm delighted to have you on the podcast. So welcome. Maybe you could start by introducing yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Phil. I'm really happy to be joining you today on the podcast. So I'm Kate Guest. As Phil says, I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Change at Historic England, and I've been at the organisation for the past 14 years, which was quite concerning when I calculated it. I've been in various roles in what is now called the Policy Development Team at Historic England. And essentially, we work with colleagues and external partners to, first of all, develop our own policies and thinking internally, and also to engage with national and local policymaking. We work across a large number of areas, from planning and listing to local government, devolution and communities. And in the policy cluster that I sit in, which is environmental management, we focus on rural, marine and climate change issues and how they relate to the historic environment. So we have a hugely varied role, from advising government on potential changes to legislation and policy, to ensure that national and local policies take heritage into account, to developing our own guidance for local authorities, planners and asset owners. And excitingly, we also carry out research and build the evidence base for different elements of heritage protection and management. So my role, for example, focuses on understanding climate change risks to heritage assets over the long term, and also on how we can adapt and increase the resilience of heritage assets to climate change impacts. So for the past sort of 18 months or so, my main focus has been on building the evidence base and submitting that to the Climate Change Committee as they develop the fourth UK climate change risk assessment. Climate change risks to cultural heritage are included in the climate change risk assessment. So we've been working with other organisations to kind of ensure that we've got the evidence to support the inclusion of risks across the whole range of heritage assets, from the built environment to archaeology, protected wrecks and marine heritage, parks, gardens, landscapes, and also to living heritage or intangible heritage.
Fantastic. Well, look, there's so much to go at today. It's going to be a great episode. Now, look, Kate, this is episode 26 of the podcast, and I think it's safe to say that in every episode we have talked about engagement. Okay, it's like it's the theme that we just can't sort of get away from, but that's because engagement is so important to building resilient places, resilient people, resilient communities. And in fact, our last episode was with David Porter, who's the president of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And one of his presidential themes was communicating better the value of infrastructure. So we had a real deep dive into that. So I suppose I'm interested to start with engagement and communication, and interested in how Historic England then use our heritage and our culture and the stories of communities as a way to engage public in the risks that our historic buildings and assets face from a changing climate.
Yeah, it's a great question. As you say, it's something that I'm sure comes up all the time. And I think it's something that we could actually do a bit more of within Historic England, but also as the heritage sector. But we are sort of increasingly seeing heritage as just that, a sort of a powerful tool to engage communities who care for and about their local assets, not just with the risks to that, their cultural heritage, but also to highlight climate change and its impacts more broadly on our society and culture. Something that I was really interested in came out a few months ago from Climate Outreach. They produced some research showing that the British public do want to see more climate and environmental content from cultural organisations across the board, from our news to arts and cultural organisations, theatres, and so on. And I think the most powerful message for me from that was that people don't need us to have all the answers in order to engage with them. And I think sometimes, not just within the heritage sector, but with any sector, you can feel a bit nervous in kind of going out and talking to the public and to the people who care for, in our cases, heritage assets, when you're not really sure necessarily what's going to happen over the long term because of the inherent uncertainty with climate change. But I think we should definitely be increasing that, because heritage is everywhere. It's our homes, it's our workplaces, it's our parks and gardens, our landscapes. And so it can definitely be a really powerful way to engage people and help them make sense of really big issues like climate change. I think cultural heritage can be a powerful source of information about how people have responded to environmental change in the past as well, and how people adapt to different climates globally. So it can also be a good source of practical information, as well as kind of harnessing that power of storytelling that heritage can really get across. I've got a really good example of this in that community came together a couple of years ago to protect a much loved heritage asset, which is the Bude Storm Tower in Cornwall. The Bude Storm Tower is a Grade 2 listed structure that was built in, I think, the 1830s on some cliffs above Summerlees Beach. And it's a very sort of iconic feature of that coastline. And it's already been moved once due to coastal erosion. It sits on a very dynamic part of the coast. So it was moved in the 1880s, so about 50 years after it was built, due to the threat of coastal erosion. But obviously that's kind of being exacerbated by factors like climate change, and it's become obvious in recent years that the tower is under threat. Once again, we've got some fantastic photographs in the Historic England Archive showing just how close it was to the cliff edge. And so in a couple of years ago, the community came together with this great crowdfunding campaign to save this local landmark. The project also got funding from, I think, Cornwall Council and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And so it was dismantled kind of piece by piece and moved inland in 2024 by about 100 metres. And there's a fantastic time-lapse video on the Bude Stratton Town Council website that shows the dismantling of this structure and them sort of rebuilding it down the line. We were involved in that project, giving advice. Our regional colleagues in the Southwest were involved. And we've also now amended the list entry on the National Heritage List for England, so that it now includes information on that relocation. And so sort of helping to ensure that that's part of the story of that asset. And it's definitely a case that we use when we want to kind of talk about the impacts that the climate change is having, but also on how people can come together and help and take action at their local sites.
Okay, that's so interesting. And I googled Bude Storm Tower whilst you were talking there, and it's a beautiful structure, and I can understand it is really iconic. And there is a picture I can see here. It is teetering on the brink. That particular photo, obviously taken before it was relocated. But as you say, vulnerability and adaptation are woven then into its own story historically. So I mean that's great, isn't it? That actually it's already had to undergo this transformation and this adaptation at a point in its previous history, and that is actually part of its own story, which I think is lovely. The fact that you're able to weave that historical vulnerability into this more subsequent relocation as well. And you referenced there the research from a few years ago, and I think what that obviously shows is that people care, don't they? People care about our heritage, our culture, their local environment, and want to be part of it, want to help preserve it, and conserve it. And I suppose then, on that point of preservation, we do want to preserve our history. But if we take the Bude Storm Tower as a really good example, these are assets, buildings that are physically, well, and literally on the edge. Now, we had a chat, you and I, last week about the podcast, and you mentioned a phrase that I'd not heard before, and it was how to lose well. So tell me about this, because sometimes assets and buildings will be lost, won't they? I mean, that is a an inevitability. So tell me about this phrase, how to lose well.
Yeah, of course. As you say, for some assets, I mean, the action that was taken at the Bude Storm Tower is obviously relatively kind of radical in that the whole structure was rebuilt elsewhere, and a great many heritage assets will be able to increase their resilience to climate change impacts through more simple measures, in terms of monitoring that risk over time to understand change, and kind of carry on functioning as normal, by perhaps, I don't know, if you're increased risk of flooding and increased rainwater rates, you might need to think about your roofing and your gutters and things like that. But for a large number of organizations and assets, that will be the case. But as you say, for a sizable minority of assets, there will need to be a greater scale of change through direct or indirect impacts, such as flooding, coastal change, or drought, or indeed through the human responses to climate change. So, for example, changes in the way that we, manage sea level rise and flooding, but also the way that we manage changes in land use. And for some assets, that will result in loss. And I think within the heritage sector, we are very accustomed to managing change within the historic environment. We do that all the time through the planning system. And also, we're used to loss in some cases because archaeological excavation is an inherently destructive process in many cases. But I think we're less comfortable with navigating the process of loss due to climate change or environmental change, which doesn't ask for permission, and there isn't even necessarily a clear end point. We don't know necessarily what climate change is going to do everywhere in the country. And so this concept of losing well is something that I first encountered a few years ago during a project which developed the concept of adaptive release, which we might talk about a bit more in a moment. But essentially, if we can't conserve something into the future, we know it's going to be lost. How do we, first of all, make the most of what we have at the moment and then say goodbye to it in a positive way? I think that sort of facilitating the process of loss in a way that involves local communities, making memories with a site, first of all, while it's still there, because in a lot of cases, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, it's going to take a long time for loss to happen. It's not just going to be, overnight. So making the most of what you have, but then also doing, kind of maybe community projects to help people process that loss. And there might also be things that we can learn from an asset during the process of loss. We're already very used to recording archaeological sites in advance of loss. And so it's how we kind of take lessons from that into sites where, that are maybe more prominent, more obvious, that we know are going to be, they are going to go. Something that we're working on at the moment is trying to get a much more kind of granular understanding of the different types of heritage assets that are at risk from different climate change hazards. We're doing a research project at the moment to look at scheduled ancient monuments along the coast to work out what types of monument are most likely to be at risk from things like coastal erosion or inundation, that we can then start to kind of understand and maybe help people prioritise the action that they take to either increase the resilience or, in some cases, to lose those assets. I think the conversations around losing well are some that we're still quite nervous to have. Nobody likes thinking about that kind of impact, but if we can do it in a positive way, and there, we can learn a lot from other cultures where this is kind of more common, globally. We did a series of webinars a few years ago where the concept of loss has come up for particularly, say, small island nations who are already confronting this. But it is something that we can absolutely learn from and hopefully do, and not just say, okay, well, we need to step back and let it go, but actually help people through that process, and maybe take some positives from it as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I'm going to sort of move the conversation on at this point, because you've just mentioned a phrase, adaptive release, in that discussion there. Now, we've talked about adaptation a lot on the podcast, and the reality is we won't be able to build resilient places, create resilient assets or resilient landscapes if we don't adapt to the effects of a changing climate. But also, what's gone before, what we've done in the past, probably won't work necessarily the same in the future. So we've got to adapt our policies, our strategies and our practices, and in the context of climate change, it isn't just a changing coastline. And you've mentioned the impacts of flooding and extreme heat and drought and so on. So let's unpick this phrase, adaptive release, then. And also, there's another phrase that I'd like to weave into this conversation, which is one of adaptation pathways, which we have talked about on other episodes of the podcast, but I'd like to talk about it now in the context of the historical environment. So yeah, adaptive release and adaptive pathways. Maybe you could take us through those.
Yeah, of course. First of all, obviously you're saying adaptations, kind of what you talk about a lot on the podcast. And I was just reflecting the other day that we often think about adaptation policy as maybe lagging a bit behind mitigation policy. Everybody kind of understands the drive to net zero, and maybe a bit less so when it comes to, adapting to the impacts that are already sort of baked in, as it were. But we have taken quite a lot of positivity from last year's COP, in that there are now heritage indicators in the global goal on adaptation. And so I'm really positive about getting more traction in the adaptation policy space, both nationally and internationally. So that was just a sort of positive note to start this bit of the discussion on. So in terms of adaptive release, first of all, it's a relatively new approach which supports the management of a heritage asset through the process of change, up to and including loss due to environmental processes such as climate change impacts. It was a concept developed through the Landscape Futures project, which ran from 2020 to 2022. It was led by Exeter University, along with UCL, Historic England, the National Trust and Natural England, who we were all co-investigators on the research project. And essentially this part of it was focused on developing a proactive approach to the management of transformation and loss of heritage assets in a more kind of creative way. And so it emphasises the need to integrate historic environment planning and natural environment planning to work with those environmental and climate change impacts that are happening at the landscape scale. And as we talked about earlier, a key part of adaptive release approaches require meaningful engagement with local communities and stakeholders. So adaptive release is an active process. It's not a synonym for more sort of passive managed decline approaches where you might say record an asset in advance of loss, make it safe, and then walk away. It's a much more active and flexible process where we might not know what the end point is, but it can help us think through the conservation of the sort of heritage values of an asset for as long as is feasible, but also consider what other values might be sort of generated as we manage that change into the long term, particularly environmental values. So there might be environmental or ecosystem benefits that we can increase at a site, even where the heritage values are decreasing over time. We're working at the moment to understand a bit more about where we think this type of approach might be appropriate. And we're doing some work with Alan Baxter Limited, World Monuments Fund and Green Gauge to help us think about the sort of viability of adaptive release as a long-term management approach to climate change. And hopefully the research report for that will be out in a few weeks' time.
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay.
So that's kind of one area of thinking that's going on. It's a kind of active area of work at the moment, as is, as you alluded to earlier, adaptive pathways. And I think while we haven't necessarily sort of actively tested adaptive release yet within the heritage sector, adaptive release might for some sites be one of the adaptive pathways that a site might be able to go down, essentially, for those already familiar with adaptive pathways. So we're essentially about to start testing a framework based on the academic approach of adaptive pathways. And again, it's about allowing for more kind of flexible ways forward than we necessarily currently think about long-term planning within the planning system, due to the inherent uncertainty of climate change. We don't want people to kind of paint themselves into a corner by investing heavily in some sort of climate resilience scheme, and then realizing in 15, 20 years' time that actually climate change impacts haven't done that, what they were expecting. And so, now they're going to have to spend, extra thought, money, time doing something else instead. So the idea is that you as a heritage asset manager would have a contingency plan. This is sort of current practice. You might have a contingency plan for when your approach to a heritage asset. So you're maybe managing a heritage asset as a visitor attraction. You might know that for some reason in the future that might no longer be viable. So you have a contingency plan. The adaptive pathways approach allows you to think through numerous contingency plans, in this case for numerous different potential climate futures. And that allows you to sort of develop a kind of dynamic pathway through those different paths, as and when different trigger points have been reached. So say, for example, coastal erosion might be impacting more of your site than you thought. And so that's a trigger point to move to a different pathway, either for the long or the short term. So the idea is that it can help us to act, but not make decisions kind of too early and find out that what we've done isn't the most appropriate action to have taken. Again, the approach that we're kind of thinking about is rooted in community engagement, co-creation of different pathways. You can develop a sort of cost-benefit analysis of different pathways, work out which ones are the most appropriate to take forward as you do this process with your stakeholders. And I think the sort of point of difference between this within the heritage sector and maybe some other sectors is that we're trying to think about how this matches up with cultural heritage capital, which is a piece of work that's progressing at the moment with colleagues in Historic England's Department for Culture, Media and Sport and elsewhere. It's essentially thinking about how we value the benefits and services that society gets from our heritage asset. Obviously, we see them as having, heritage services. That's why they're special. That's why they're significant as heritage assets. But what other values do they have in terms of, are they places of education, well-being? Do they have, natural and ecosystem values as landscapes or parks, places that bring economic benefits to their sort of locality? And so we're thinking that changes in the sort of network of these benefits might be a way of identifying the trigger points at which you agree to move from one pathway to another within your kind of adaptive pathways framework. Again, it's sort of relatively early days with that for us. We are kind of testing it at the moment, but it's quite an exciting time to be part of the conversation. It's already being used within other sectors, and the Environment Agency is sort of testing a variation of adaptive pathways in terms of flooding and coastal erosion risk management within the UK. And so it's a piece of work that I'm really interested in and excited about. And in terms of just it is a sort of hypothetical example, but just giving people a way to kind of, if you're thinking, what does she mean by that? Say you have a historic coastal fort site that is vulnerable, it's already vulnerable to coastal change, sea level rise, inundation, that kind of thing. And it's becoming increasingly vulnerable due to, say, increased stormy weather that is starting to maybe undermine the foundations of that site. If you keep on the current sort of management trajectory of that site, say as a visitor attraction, that its heritage services are going to decrease over time. It's not safe for people to visit for a start. And ultimately the site is going to be lost due to coastal erosion. What you might do is say, well, we're pretty sure that if we build up the sea level defences, for now, that may buy us 20 to 30 years where we can still have relatively normal heritage services coming from that site. And so you might invest that money over the short term and use that time to engage your stakeholders, carry out an adaptive pathway process, which might bring up some more kind of radical options of how to manage that loss in the long term. So, for example, you might decide that you could actually take down parts of the assets to keep increasing the sea defences over a longer period of time. So the site would look different, but it would still have some sort of heritage value. But then maybe over the long term, what you think is a different pathway might be, okay, what's the point spending further money on the sea defences because we know the site is going to go. But could we invest some money in understanding what the ecosystem values that we might get out of this are? If it's a coastal site, you might be able to say manage it as an artificial reef as the site is lost, perhaps for seabirds or other types of marine life that might like to kind of live in the asset as it declines. And that is something that does happen now in assets that have been kind of left. But is this a process that we can manage more actively? Have a kind of conscious pathway to think about how we manage the loss of heritage values, but maybe increase the other values that you might get from that site. It's not just going to be an empty space. There's always going to be something there, and what can we do with it over the long term?
Yeah, and I really like the adaptation pathway approach, actually, because it's rooted in the need for flexibility over time, and as you say, rather than sometimes when we try to manage risk, we try to design it out from day one. But actually this is about honesty, and it's about grown up effective engagement and saying there are a number of pathways here and there's a number of trigger points, and let's just bank those, and let's just see and give ourselves that flexibility, so that as we reach a number of different trigger points and we don't quite know necessarily what those might be or which one of those might come first, then actually we can flex and adapt, rather than as you say, investing in something that might not be the most suitable or sustainable or indeed resilient for that particular asset or landscape or place right now. Kate, we've almost sort of running out of time soon, but there is one point I'd like to talk about finally, and that is what Historic England are doing to support all the different owners of historic buildings around the UK, be that landowners or heritage trusts or churches or other assets. If you are an owner of one of these, what advice and support can Historic England give to you?
Yeah, of course. As I say, many owners and managers will be able to increase the resilience of their assets. And we are working to develop advice, both for the people that kind of own and manage these assets, but also for the professionals who need to carry out that work in an appropriate way. To increase the resilience, and also for local planning authorities who need to make those decisions on listed building and other consents as they kind of come forward. So we already have quite a lot of content on our website to help people start thinking about risks to their assets in terms of sort of both sides of climate action. Really, we have a lot of information on how you might make your historic building more energy efficient, how you might sort of retrofit in that space. We have our brilliant technical conservation team are always updating those pages, and we're also got an increasing amount of content on our website, which is all sort of free and publicly available, on risk assessments and adaptation. So we particularly have recent work on flood resilience, and also what people might start to think about if their heritage asset is kind of overheating and causing problems for people during the summer months. So first really check out our website, but there's also quite a lot of work underway. We actually did a piece of work it feels like a long time ago now, but it was only last year, with JBA, looking at climate change risk assessment. Essentially, your colleagues helped us think about a climate change risk assessment methodology that would be flexible enough to allow people to start thinking about their climate change risk, even if they don't have very much experience in this space, all the way up to people who have maybe quite a lot of resource, quite a lot of expertise and understanding already. So that was published as a research report, which is on our website. And what we're doing with that now is kind of going through it and writing it up as a sort of climate change risk assessment brief that would help people actually carry these assessments out on their sites. That's something that we're testing at the moment with various other heritage organisations, and we will add that to the website once we've kind of got that. But essentially, the climate change homepage on our website, which is it's relatively easy to find from the Historic England homepage, is the place to go for advice and guidance from us.
Fantastic. Thank you. Kate, it's been a really great conversation today. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I've really enjoyed it. So many different perspectives that we've talked about. And it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we've reached the end of our time today. If you've enjoyed listening, please hit the subscribe button so you're ready for our next episode in a month's time. And if you'd like to support the show, consider sharing it with others or leaving us a short review wherever you're listening. It really helps more people to discover and enjoy the podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Eminson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.